Hi, hey,
Hey, calling Chris Anderson.
in yet another hotel room
Yeah,
somewhere.
where is it? Where is it?
Yeah, I'm in Oosterbeek, just outside of Arnhem, and still plugging away on the 80th anniversary tour. So yeah, and you look like you're back home.
I came back last night.
How was
Long,
that?
long trip from Paris to Munich to
Yeah.
Chicago. So I may not be as tired as you, but I claim some as well. Hey, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping us to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH podcast, we're
Yeah.
glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about women who served in World War II. And Chris, we should shout out to our Patreon supporters, don't you think?
Absolutely. Very special, important people.
Yeah. So we have a list, and we have for 2 weeks in a row now we've spelled Matt Brogie's name correctly.
We got to do something about that.
We're going to see how long the streak can last, because we've done it before and then had it fade away. So. But you can become a top shelf patron or a patron at any level. We appreciate all our Patreon supporters.
Absolutely.
By going to patreon.com/history happy hour. So let us know that you're out there and what that you're here and what you're drinking. And Chris, I wanted to share 2 pictures from the trip. Okay. So the first one is a picture of us with our 2-time guest, David O'Keefe. Who was also leading a tour. I think I look like a postal telegraph boy there, but
a snappy one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. And I should never have taken that jacket off, but it was a warm day. But then here's one to try to arouse your jealousies. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
You know what you're seeing in this picture?
I do. That's Bill Millen's son, isn't it?
And his grandson.
Wow.
Standing under the statue of Bill Millen, who was the piper who came ashore with Lord Lovett's commandos at Sword Beach on the morning of June 6th.
Cool.
Yeah, it was cool. And we saw them playing later on at Runville Cemetery. So that was really excellent.
I'm a little jealous.
Yeah. So, Chris, is anybody out there joining us?
Yes. Nancy Nylens is joining us, and Lizzie Borden from London. Hello, Lizzie. Brian Peacock, Susan Yu, Ken, who I'm going to be seeing soon. Matt Brogy, who says he's very pleased that we spelled
his name is being spelled correctly. He should be, because he really made a out of it. So, all right. Well, we got a lot of folks here, and I know you want to see Lena Andrews. So, Chris, give me a cue, and we'll start the open and kind of get on the way with this show.
The bar is open.
Bar is open, and today what we're serving, the topic is the 350,000 women who served in uniform during World War II, and there's a new book out about them called Valiant Women, the Extraordinary American Servicewomen who helped win World War II, and our guest today is the author of that book, Lena Andrews. She is a military analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. She has spent more than a decade in foreign policy, having previously worked at the Rand Corporation and the United States Institute of Peace. She has a PhD in political science from MIT, and she is a native, Chris, of Boston, Massachusetts. So,
hey, there you go,
Lena Andrews. Where are you from in Boston?
I'm from Newton, Massachusetts, which is 15 minutes.
It's not really Boston. It's not really Boston.
I know, but most people don't, call me on it. So thank you, Rick, for that.
Yeah. Well,
Chris is a Boston native.
Yeah, born in Dorchester. Dorchester.
Oh wow! Okay, that's real Boston.
Yeah. That's real Boston, and I'm a level faker, which is I lived there for 30 years, but I didn't spend any of my childhood there. So I was born.
But you kept your Boston area code, so that's good though. I heard Lena did as well, so you have to hang on to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
617 for life. I'll never give it up.
Oh, yeah.
Super. Lena, did you bring a drink to our happy circus here?
I brought a form of a drink. This is my coffee for
Coffee,
the end of
always
the
a good
day, end of
choice.
Sunday. I have 2 small kids, and so this is the only thing that keeps me going after a full day. But I'll say the only thing I'll mention is it has this neat Howard County Veterans Foundation on it. It's my very
nice.
prized tumbler, and it's from a wonderful organization in Maryland, and I got to interview one of the World War II veterans before she passed, who was a part of it. So it is my favorite coffee tumbler. I bring it with me everywhere I go.
Nice. And Chris, what about you? Did you bring a drink today?
I have cheap hotel red wine. So
excellent. And I'm drinking a nice Temperance Gate Crasher. So
Temperance.
we've paid homage to the devil of alcohol and non-alcohol. So let's get on with it. Lena, so you work for the CIA, which obviously you're not going to tell us anything about that. And you have a PhD from MIT, and you have all this experience in foreign policy. So naturally, you would be immediately drawn to write about service women in World War II. I don't quite understand the connection. So what led you to write this book?
Yeah. On the face of it, I admit it doesn't necessarily all line up. But it does. There's an arc in my own mind, which is to say, for a long time, I've studied military operations and their effectiveness in a sort of conventional context and in a contemporary context. And it turns out that if you want to understand a lot of the major conflicts that we're talking about today, conflicts in the Pacific, active conflicts in Europe, the last time we fought large-scale conventional wars was in World War II, as you guys know better than anyone, having just been and still being in Europe. So for me, that is sort of the touchstone of a lot of my own military analysis, because it's really the last time we have good experience fighting these sorts of large-scale wars. And I'm also sort of a historian at heart, which I realized very late in my career, which, is a occupational hazard of being a political scientist, is that sometimes you realize you're a historian. In fact, I was one of those. But what came as a surprise to me is actually the women's part of it. I spent most of my time just thinking about sort of pure and simple evaluation of military operations. And it wasn't until much later in my understanding of World War II that women really came into the picture for me as a new and interesting lens to look at this sort of what can sometimes get a bad reputation as a old conflict, a dusty conflict.
Right. So I think, obviously World War II is the moment that really changes, I think, the role of women in military service. But just to kind of have a baseline, maybe you could talk briefly about what are the origins of this, and are there any roots to women's service, military service with the U.S. before the war, and what are they?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I don't talk about it as much in the book as I would have liked to, but we have lots of examples of women in the United States. And I focus on the United States in the book, although if I could have, I would have written a 700-page book on all of the women who served in World War II across nationally. But what I do say is that, of course, there is a long legacy of women serving near or at the front lines. Most commonly, we think of that being, American nurses who served at least since the Revolution, if not before then. And they have been sort of in and around military operations for a long time. The first time that we saw it in a large scale capacity was in World War I. Some of you may have heard of the Hello Girls, the women who went and were phone operators, in World War I. And there were also women in the Navy integrated in World War II, but not at the scale, as you said, Chris. I mean, 350,000 American women, to give people a sense of scope, is about the size of today's active duty Navy. So it's an enormous amount of people. And of course, the scale of World War II is big everywhere. But that sort of largesse of women participating in these critical supply and support roles didn't really happen until World War II, as you said, and from there it catapults, and I'm glad it did.
So early in the book, you write that World War II, while unparalleled in its scale, was equally exceptional in how it was fought, and you suggest that this has a lot to do with why women were eventually brought into the armed services. Can you amplify that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, I come from a kind of purely military perspective, which is to say, I spent a lot of time thinking about how World War II was fought. And what people forget is that, in 1940 and 1941, the stuff that we were talking about in World War II, the way that we were talking about fighting, it was totally cutting edge. Radar, mechanization, airplanes, all of these things were really being deployed on a large scale, as you both know, for the first time. But a lot with all that material, with all that stuff, with all that heft that was essential to our strategy, it meant that we needed a lot of people, not just at home, but also abroad. And those two priorities were so central to Marshall and sort of the key military planners' conception of how the war would be fought. They knew they would need a lot of people, and they would need a lot of people fast. And that's something you see in Marshall's memoirs sort of everywhere. And initially, they sort of thought they could get away with it by moving men around and lowering the age, and lowering the requirements. But by 1941, maybe even a little bit earlier, it becomes clear that there are just too many people that are necessary to implement this doctrine on such a wide scale. And I'll also say this was the first really global war, aside from World War I, of course, but that the United States was going to be in from basically the get-go. And so, those demands required more people. And that was the first time, in American history, we couldn't meet the demands of this war with just men alone. And it was that sort of very military, very pragmatic concern that got a lot of those early leaders thinking about women in the first place, which most people forget these days. We always think we came in and we won, and the war began on June 6th when we landed in Normandy. It did not. It was a long and difficult process to get there.
Chris, can I follow up?
Just this once.
Okay, thank you so much. Because you mentioned George Marshall, and so I wanted to use that to play a little soundbite from George Marshall, who this is from 1943, when the Army changes the WWII from an auxiliary organization to part of the Army, which you write about in the book. And here he is with Avetta Hobby, who is the head of the WWII. She's not speaking, but George Marshall is.
Conservation of manpower is a matter of first importance. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was organized to assist in meeting this need by releasing soldiers from non-combat duties. These women are to take over the jobs of soldiers behind the lines and here at home. Already they are doing this in a very fine manner. The Corps is a most important element of the Army, and I personally am intensely interested in its rapid development in strength as well as in training.
So he's selling this pretty hard. Is that because he's a big believer in it, or because he senses that there's a lot of opposition to it, or kind of what's behind that there?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, Marshall is probably my favorite commander of the 20th century. I just think he's a genius for many reasons. He was also a deep pragmatist. And, initially he was very wary of women for all of the reasons you might imagine. And people forget that in 1940, 1941, having a woman in uniform was a pretty alien concept to everyone. And Marshall was included in that. He knew how hard it would be. But again, he saw the demands of the day and understood he was going to have to get creative. At that moment, there's a lot going on when he's speaking about the transition to the formal integration of women in the Army. Originally, they had been in an auxiliary force. Two things are happening. First, well, I'll explain it this way. The first thing is that the Army way underestimated the amount of interest that American women would have in being in the Army. I think at the first year, they thought they would get 10,000 women signed up. They got 60,000 women signed up. In New York City alone, there were like 1,000 women on the first day signing up for the Army. So they had vastly underestimated the number of women who were interested. And then in 1943, the smear campaign comes along, and it totally decimates the recruiting for particularly the Women's Army. And so Marshall, in the intervening period, had seen how much interest there was, how much, women could do in this space. And then suddenly that tap gets shut off. And part of the reinvigoration of the program, the incorporation of them into the Army, is a response to the recognition, one, that they're really good at what they're doing, but also that if they're not careful, they could lose that resource. They could lose women as a resource in the Army. And so he becomes a really vocal advocate of getting women into uniform, more so than he'd been at any point in the war, right around 1943.
So, Lena, is a situation of just kind of plain old necessity, because the U.S. Army is not in a great place as the war starts. Is it necessity that helps these organizations become created, or is it women advocating for saying, hey, we have a right to take part in all this, and we want to be a part of all this, and kind of who's driving that train?
Both. I think one of the amazing things about this, and I think it's really a lesson that extends beyond World War II, is that women were just looking for the opportunity. So I read these amazing stories about essentially, for the first couple of years of the war, when women are denied these opportunities, they basically create quasi-military organizations and develop military missions. Of course, there's all this homeland stuff that they're doing, air observers and Red Cross and sort of things like that. But a lot of women want to be in uniform. They're looking for that opportunity and they don't have it. So they get really creative and they start these little like militia groups, essentially. Right. But that's how committed they were to this interest. And it's not just an Army thing. The Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, to a certain extent, the Army Air Forces have all just an enormous amount of demand. They all have women's programs and they're all oversubscribed, particularly at the beginning. Now, at the same time, there is this huge demand signal. Now, it depends on which leader you're talking about to understand whether or not they saw that demand signal and were willing to listen to it initially. But eventually, everybody kind of gets on board. And I think what's amazing is to see how not only was it necessary, but women were often very efficient at the jobs to which they were assigned, right? Like women were teachers, they were secretaries, they were telephone operators. Those are all critical skill sets in World War II. I say that, an errant decimal point in the headquarters of Eisenhower is actually a serious problem because this is a war of paperwork. So if you don't have women who understand how to file, it really actually becomes an issue. And of course, they're doing other things. But I think the combination of women's enthusiasm, the necessity component, and then, of course, their ability to do the job just creates this surge of interest and a surge of excitement around women, particularly early, about what they could do and how much they can contribute. At one point, I think in 1942, I'm getting my dates a little bit wrong here, but there was a point where they were asking for over 1 million WACs, 1 million women in the Army. The Air Force had put in a request for like 500,000 women. There was just such enthusiasm.
But this is after initially saying like, yeah, no, none, maybe 500. Right. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is they go from like they being traditional male military, from digging in their heels saying this is not going to happen or it's only going to happen a little bit, and then almost overnight they're like more
around there.
Yeah, and but to me this is a great lesson about military leadership and leadership in general, about what it takes to be a good commander. I don't fault Marshall or Eisenhower, and Eisenhower is my favorite example of this. He writes in his memoir, he like full mea culpa. I didn't think women were going to be useful. The moment I got, this really small detachment of 5 women in my headquarters, it became clear that they were excellent at their jobs. He requests a company of women to come over and basically, reinvigorate the challenge that he's having of keeping up with all this paperwork for North Africa, and is so adamantly committed to women serving that after his retirement in 1948, it's 1946, he comes back and testifies in front of Congress to say, look, I doubted these women. I didn't think they were useful, but I saw on the ground how useful they were, and they must be integrated into the armed forces permanently because they're too good at their jobs. And that to me is the mark of a really good commander, to be able to see what's going on the battlefield, what the needs are, and to admit that you may have gotten it wrong on the first chance. That to me is just like really exceptional. Other commanders, not so great. They were holding till the very end. I don't give them as much credit, but where I see these guys really coming around, I have to say, hats off to you. And I think it's also reflected in their battlefield leadership. These were people who could adapt, and ultimately that's the most important thing in these sort of major campaigns. So I give them a little bit of credit, not all of it, but a little.
Well, you've praised Dwight Eisenhower, so Chris is going to be a fan for life.
Yeah. He's one of my faves too. I like him. There's a bunch of things that we've talked about that I kind of want to parse, but the first one is just as a basic thing, talking about the WACs, which is the Army
initially an auxiliary corps, later part of the Army. The first director of the WACS is a woman named Oveta Hobby, and she is a pretty fascinating person. Can you tell us a little bit about her background and how she got involved and what she did?
Yeah, I love Hobby. She was one of the first archives I visited. Her papers are held at Rice University, and it was such a joy to learn about her because she was, I think I say in the book, she was exceptional by every standard, but especially by the standards of the time. Her dad was a legislator in Texas, and you can imagine being in Houston, or, she wasn't in Houston then, but being in Texas in the early 1920s as a young, plucky woman. She came up against a lot of sort of bulwarks and challenges in her own life, but she was so undeterred. She ran for office. She was at one point the parliamentarian of the Texas legislature. She she ends up marrying one of the most well-known politicians of the time in Texas and becomes the editor of the major newspaper there. She is just sort of ceaselessly has energy and enthusiasm for politics and for social life and for the scene in Texas. But she's sort of obscure at the time that the war starts. And she's plucked out of obscurity by Eleanor Roosevelt, who knows her. The Roosevelts know her and her family very well. And she's sort of brought in the fold to run what's called the Women's Interest section, which is just, I think it's something, the tagline was essentially, to inform the wives, mothers, and sweethearts about what the war would entail. So it's basically a PR for women. But she is so effective in that job that when they start looking for someone to head this first and most important women's organization, because it is the first to be, ultimately integrated into the Army, the answer is Hobby. It has to be Hobby. She's done such an incredible job. She has such a sense for women. And she's this really charismatic and practical leader. And so they sort of pluck her out of obscurity. Nobody knows who she is. And before there can even be a fight about who should do this, they put her into this role. And the other thing I like to say is she was an extraordinarily fashionable and sort of like classic 1940s beauty. And my favorite story about her, there were two separate articles about her in Vogue, but my favorite story about her is that when the WAC becomes integrated, she's in this beautiful, perfect outfit. It's her last civilian photo that she'll ever be in. She has this great hat on, it's a wide brim, and she's wearing her oath, and the hat casts a shadow and they can't get a photo of her, and she refuses to take it off because it was essential to her outfit. And that sort of adamance about getting her understanding of how important the sort of objective look of this doesn't sound like a big deal, doesn't sound like something that mattered, but it was hugely important at the time because the PR, the image was so critical, and she knew she had to look just right. So I just love that she had that sense for all of these things, and it carries through her leadership the entire time. So I'm a big Hobby fan, as you can tell. I really love her. She's great.
But there were some other, a lot of the women that go on to lead their respective services are very, very impressive in their own right. And as are some of the initial recruits. So, Rick kind of mentioned Hobby, but I also wanted you to talk a little bit about, there was a woman who had a lot to do with the waves getting started, Dr. Margaret Chung, because I think it's inspirational, but I also think it's sad in a way, and it kind of highlights that, all is not well in the whole creation of this whole idea.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked about Margaret Chung. She is an inspiration to me. I think she should be much better known. And also, I think it gives me an opportunity to say something about Valiant Women, the book, which is that I really try to be very brutally honest about how inspiring the story was and how challenging the story is. Because as you all know, doing the work that you do, history is not uncomplicated. That's the point. Our job is to understand its nuance and its complication. And I think Margaret Chung, and quite frankly, many of these women, is the perfect example of that. So for those of you who don't know her, she is a Chinese-American woman who lives on the West Coast. She's one of the first Chinese-American women to get her medical license in California right around the turn of the century. She, as an aside, while she was getting her license, dressed as a man and called herself Mike, which I think is a terrific little anecdote to give you a sense of how sort of like quirky she was. She gets her medical license. She begins a practice in California and becomes sort of well known among a certain Hollywood set. But the other set that she becomes well known among in the 1930s, if folks remember and know, as I'm sure your audience does, is that there's this major, fight going on between the Chinese and the Japanese in the 30s. And so the naval community that had emerged in California at that time, because as we all know, it's a huge hub for the Navy, comes to Margaret Chung. A couple of these guys come to Margaret Chung and they say, we'd like to fight for the Chinese. Can you help us? And she says, I'm a doctor. I have no connection to the military effort in China. And so I can't help you with that. But what I can do is give you a home cooked meal. And so she does this. She invites these Navy men over to her home, and she begins this prolific relationship with the naval community in California. At one point, she has something like hundreds of what she called adoptive sons who are coming to her house and having these dinners. And she's so famous at the time for her, because of course she's a Chinese American woman. She hates the Japanese. At the time, that's really important. She's in a movie. There's a cartoon named after her. She's super famous. And one day she wakes up and she says, why can't women serve in the Navy? I'd like to serve in the Navy, in fact. And they say, well, there's no organization for women to serve in the Navy. This is right around 41, 42. So if you wanted to do that, you'd have to create a whole organization, which have to be congressionally approved. And she says, okay, that's what I'll do. Recognizing that she has hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of really influential Navy men at her disposal. So she calls two of them up, a senator and a congressman, and basically insists that they create a proposal and push through a proposal for the women, what becomes the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, the WWII, which is the Navy's women's organization. And she does a ton of lobbying to get it through. So she's at the center of why the Navy incorporates women in the first place. She tries to sign up for the WWII 3 times. She's told twice that the timing is not right. And the third time she's told that she's too old, because at this time she's in her late 40s, almost 50. That's not true. The Navy made many exceptions for older people to serve in critical roles, and Margaret Chung should have probably been accepted. But unfortunately, she was a Chinese American woman. She was also rumored to be a lesbian, which she was. And she was, on the face of it, not the sort of image that the Navy was looking to portray at that time. And so I think that arc of this woman who was at the very center of creating this incredibly important organization for women's progress in the military, being then denied an opportunity to remain at the center of it, is a really, really important historical point. And one that I think is just really telling about the times and the challenges, particularly of women of color and queer women who were trying to serve their country as much as any other American was at the time.
So I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You were talking about before the Army established the WWII as part of the Army. You talked about the smear campaign. And I think this ties into the fact that there's a lot of issues that certain amounts of the public have with the WWII. And I don't know if this is connected with the smear campaign, but you quote some letters written by soldiers who had a wife or mother considering joining. And I just want to read a couple of these quotes. One says, "Get that damn divorce. I don't want no damned whack for a wife." And somebody else says, "I am stopping all allotments to her and I am breaking off all contact with her." Talking about somebody who's joined. And my favorite one is, "Are you going to be a whack mother? If you did or do, I will disown you." So, okay, that's rough. But is that what you're talking about, or is there something else? What is the smear campaign that you're talking about? And put that in the context of general public criticism.
Well, if I want to just jump on Rick's question. Maybe you could also talk about Mr. Conway, and because he has some of an interesting article that.
Yes. Yeah. So here's the reality of the sort of situation at the time. Like I said, 1941, very different time. Although there are echoes of this today, I think we got to be honest about that. But there was rightly, in across the board, both the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, everybody was very concerned about the public backlash to putting women in a uniform. There was a real concern, and I think it was, quite frankly, well-founded, that the public would see this as sort of the defeminization of women, American women. And at the time, that was really top of mind for military leaders. They had good reason to believe that. It was in the floor debate about these things in the Congress. There's one congressman who's like, the horror, what will happen to American womanhood, right? There was a very vocal contingent of both Congress, and I think reflective of certain parts of the population, that just felt this was beyond the pale of sort of what was acceptable for women to do. Never mind that this was necessary and that most military leaders were, supporting it at this point. But as I said, there was this huge surge of interest early on, 1942, early 1943, just hundreds of thousands of women are signing up. Now, there are many people who don't like this. Some of them are public figures with platforms to derail and demean women who are signing up to serve their country. One of them writes an article that is nationally syndicated, which basically accuses the WWII of using these women as prostitutes, which is a well-known trope about sort of women in uniform. It had been, it's followed women in uniform for their entire service. It's infuriating and wrong, but it was a trope that was built on and amplified by this particular article. And because it was nationally syndicated, it got a lot of press. And many of the men who read it, particularly men downrange, men in, serving in combat, had never met a WWII before because, they were a relatively small part of the forces. And so they believed it. And they had this really outsized negative reaction, rightly. I mean, if someone told you this and you believed it to be true, you would think, oh, that's awful. And you would not want anyone to be a part of it. Now, of course, it wasn't true. Couldn't have been further from the truth. The rates of this were very, not prostitution, but even sort of any romantic involvement was really low among this community. But people believed it, right? And that, I think, tells you something really interesting about the time, that they could believe that the U.S. Army would be doing this with women, and that was a possibility, I think, is really telling about the time. And so it, as I mentioned before, all that goodwill, all of what these women had done, all that recruiting just goes off a cliff. It becomes really hard for the Army to recruit. Marshall has to get involved. Roosevelt has to get involved to reinvigorate the program. And in fact, the FBI has to investigate whether or not these rumors, the smear campaign, was an act of propaganda by the Axis. What they find is that it wasn't. It was just people in communities willing to believe a really salacious rumor about women who, quite frankly, were just trying to do their job.
Nothing changes over the years, I guess.
I know, it's like it was the original sort of, I don't want to say fake news, but that's sort of like what it was like.
But you did want to say it.
And we're seeing all these things about AI, things that are blowing up on Instagram, and people just are retweeting it. That's sort of what this was for the time. It was salacious and scary, and so people just kept saying it and believing it. And it's a shame because it had so many downstream effects that were devastating for these women, for their families, for the country, for the war effort, and it was really it's a real dark mark, I think, on the experience of women who served.
Well, this kind of leads me to my next question. As somebody who lives overseas, and I live in the UK, and I'm always interested in kind of the relationship between Great Britain and the United States during the war. Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the involvement of Britain, and because Britain had already had an experience, they had mobilized their women on a massive scale. So I'm kind of curious, it's like the differences between them and us in that regard, and then did that experience impact on Hobby and some of the other women as they're trying to form women's only branches of the service?
Absolutely. And, as I was going through the archives and doing this research, one of the really fun parts of it was to see the British manuals that they would have, that the women who are in charge of these organizations were reading to figure out how the British had done this, because they did it, as you said, on a much larger scale. The population was, of course, much smaller in the UK. And so much earlier and in a much more, I think, robust way, women were integrated into the armed forces. Now, that had some really tricky downstream effects, which is that I think there's a little bit more, my sense is, I'm not sure if this is borne out by the evidence, my sense is that there was a little bit more negative memories of and reaction to women's service in the UK than there was in the United States, where everyone was a volunteer. So all of the 350,000 American women who signed up, they signed up as volunteers. They wanted to do this. And so there was no sort of conscription element of it. And they were able, to a certain extent, to direct some of their placement. So I think all of that helped to make American women's experiences a little bit more positive, a little bit better in many ways. But the women's leaders, Hobby, Mildred McAfee, who ran the Waves, Ruth Streeter, who ran the Marine Corps, Stratton, who ran the SPARS, the Coast Guard, they were all, first of all, they're all just so savvy about this and about the need to really learn and know what they're getting into. But they looked to the British for advice. And early on, Hobby in particular has a meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt's Hobby and Jean Knox, who's the head of one of the biggest British services at the time, women's services at the time. And she says in no, no uncertain terms, that the main thing that they should learn from the British is that there cannot be a scandal. Any whiff of scandal will decimate the program. And of course, what we just talked about bears that out perfectly, right? And they were this is why I think there was so much concern about image, why Ovida Kopabi is not willing to change her hat, why they're obsessed with things like the length of their skirts and all that stuff, because they knew that any little thing that undercut the women's integrity would be devastating to the program. And of course it was. And the last thing I'll just add on that is that in addition to learning from the British and the Canadians and all the other, states that were doing this and done this earlier, they're also learning from each other. So the Navy learns from the Army's experience with the smear campaign that they can't be caught in that sort of stream. They need to figure out how to distinguish themselves, and they work very hard to make sure that there's a firm line between sort of Navy women and Army women. They're different. They do sorts of different things, and I think it's really interesting the way that these leaders were so, and it's not like the Army was upset about that. They wanted them. They wanted the other services to learn from these experiences. There's such a community around what they were doing, both globally and internally, and I think that's a really, really wonderful thing.
We talked about the smear campaign, which is sort of exterior, kind of attacking the WWII, but what sort of mistreatment or harassment did women have to deal with inside the military? I know that's still an issue today, and one of our viewers talks about having been a WWII in 1975 and listening to our discussion, and she says, "Oh, it hasn't changed since when I joined." But what kind of mistreatment did they deal with, and how did they deal with it?
Yeah, this is my great sort of sadness about writing this book, is that the echoes are strong. And even as I talk to women veterans of later wars and of later versions of this, I think there are so many parts of this that still exist today. Even the way in which there was a whole conversation in World War II about whether or not women could be in and around guns and in and around combat. The fact is they were, and they had to be based on their jobs. And the reality was totally ignored by the political conversation, which I think, again, that has an echo today. But as you said, the mistreatment element of this was really hard for me to write about. It was also really important for me to write about because it felt like a really big part of many women's experiences. It was not the only part of their experience, of course. And many of them, when I talked particularly to veterans in person, they said, yeah, there were hard parts of this, but it wasn't the only part of it. It wasn't why I was there. It wasn't the animating feature of my experience, but it was everything from, being denied a promotion because they wouldn't go on a date with a superior officer, to in some cases, really violent acts of sexual assault that were reported and totally ignored or dismissed on the basis of just really horrifying twisted logic from military commanders, and you can see it all because they've written it down in the report about why they're dismissing it, and you sort of read through it with shock and horror. So, what was amazing about it is that these women face these things often daily, not those really nasty bits, but the sort of run-of-the-mill sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace, and they did their jobs anyway. And I talked to one woman in particular about it, one veteran who was very, very quick about it. She just sort of said, that was just what it was in 1943. That was going to work, being expected to go to dances with soldiers after work. That was part of my day. And so the way in which they navigate that I found to be really at once heartbreaking, but also very inspirational, because they knew that they had a job to do and they kind of ignored a lot of the noise around them as a result of it. And I'll just add really quickly that, it was hard for every woman who served in uniform. It was particularly hard for women of color. I talk a lot in the book about the women of the 688, the women who served in Europe.
Postal Battalion.
Yeah, they're getting a lot of overdue credit these days, and I'm so glad they are. But they, the ways in which they're both getting it from men in uniform and out of uniform, and civilian men, and also, women who are serving alongside them, white women who are serving alongside them, who are affronted by the notion of Black women in uniform, is really that experience. Again, to talk about that nuance and that complication, it is really epitomized in that story.
Yeah, and I want to jump on that, because that was a question I had. One of the things I really appreciated about the book is it wasn't a kind of flag waving, hey, this was great and it all turned out well, and this is a great story. You deal with some of the difficult issues. So talk a little bit more about women of color and how they get involved, and it's different from service to service. I know you talk a little bit about how the Navy, for example, deliberately doesn't say, but they imply that they want all of their recruits to be white, middle class. So how does this play out in the different services, and what sort of things are we confronting?
Yeah, it is like all militaries. I think even today, it is such a microcosm of all of the different forces in society. That's what I find so interesting about it as a historian. And, for Black women in particular, I think a lot of this is really crystallized in their experiences. Before I get to that, I'll just also add there were many Asian American women who had really challenging and also very complex and interesting experiences. One I talk about in the book, Susan Ahn, the first Korean American woman to serve in the Navy. She talks about a lot of the racism she faced, but she goes on to be one of the first women gunnery instructors in the Navy, period, because she's just that good at her job. There are Japanese women who are signing up straight from internment camps. There's like the whole, just these stories of patriotism among women of color are extraordinary. Same thing goes for queer women and women who would have probably, by the standards of today, identified as lesbian or in some cases transgender. But, Black women, again, I think have a sort of unique position because they are so visibly not what the Army and Navy and all of the services are looking for. They want, as you said, sort of a very clean-cut image of the American woman. And in 1941, that is not a Black woman. That's simply the case, right? And so the services go about it in different ways. In the Army, from the start, Black women are recruited at the percent that they are believed to be sort of appropriately matching the population, which is 10% of the WWIIs were supposed to be Black women. They don't always hit that for lots of reasons that you can imagine. They have a lot of trouble recruiting because they're not advertising that they want Black women. And those women are in segregated units. So they are in a whole sort of separate experience. And that's why the 688 is led by Charity Adams, the extraordinary commander of that unit, one of the highest ranking Black women in the Army at that time. But the Navy goes about it very differently. They're very late to the game in the sort of men's context and also in the women's context. They don't start integrating women into their forces until 1944. They do so very late, but they do it in an integrated way. So when Black women are integrated into the Navy more holistically. And you can think about both of those experiences as being really telling because neither of them are perfect. In fact, they're far from it. In one sense, Black women are there from the start, but they're segregated, at times at great cost to the U.S. Army for kind of no reason, whereas the Navy takes forever, but when they do it sort of in an integrated way. And so there's no shining example of how this should have been done at the time. But it's, I think, really important to just lay that out there and let people come to their own conclusions about it.
So there's a lot of issues here, but ultimately women play a very key role in a lot of areas, and they're very involved in aviation, both with the Army Air Corps and the Navy. And you write that by the end of the war, at least according to one source, every naval aviator going into combat received some part of his training from a woman, and that over 1,000 women taught aviators in advanced courses like instrument flying. So they're not, there's 350,000 women versus what was it, 16 million men, something like that. So it's a small number of people, but they are really deeply involved, and especially in this aviation area.
Yeah, it's my favorite example. I'm so glad you brought it up. And I can't believe we've gone this long without me talking about aviation. That's sort of where my heart lies with World War II. It's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, was on aviation. And so when I saw the way in which women were at every step of the way in the aviation community, it really kind of warmed my heart. I think that's probably because aviators at the time were the mavericks of, they were the new kids on the block. They were trying to make their way in the same way that women were. They weren't necessarily, World War II was such a proving ground for the Army Air Forces that they kind of had to be a little bit, I don't know, like more adventurous than the other services. And I think that's borne out in the experiences. So I talk about, if you chart the journey of a sort of traditional airplane through World War II, you see women all along the way. So this is one of my favorite photos. This is Naval Air Station Jacksonville, where I had the privilege of interviewing a woman who worked there, Jessie Contrabecchi. She was a maintainer here, and we often think about women sort of in the manufacturing industry. She was redeploying planes that had been brought back from the Pacific and been shot up at a point in the war where maintenance was critically important. And the story I love to tell about her is that she became one of the most effective maintainers at Naval Air Station Jacksonville because she had small hands, and so she was really good at getting into the little parts and pieces, the altimeters and the gauges that she needed to fix in this context. But it wasn't just women like Jessie Contrabecchi. It was also women like Susan Ahn, who I just mentioned, the first Korean American woman who was doing exactly that sort of training. There was a period in which we didn't have enough pilots, and so taking them off the front line to train other pilots was a huge waste of resources. But it turns out to teach someone to fly, you don't actually have to fly yourself. You just have to learn how to use what they call the link trainer. And Susan Ahn does that. She does it beautifully. She's whip smart. She's a great instructor. And she's teaching men how to fly their planes. And the last example I like to talk about is Anne Baumgartner, who's right at the beginning of the aviation chain. She was part of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which was technically a civilian organization, but have later been recognized as being basically a military organization. And she was ferrying all of the planes, every single type of plane that you can imagine in World War II, from manufacturing facilities to the bases where they were needed. Because it's not like they showed up at the right place at the right time. Someone had to get it there, and using an Air Force pilot for that would have been a huge waste of resources. So they got over 1,000 women to do this job. And it was dangerous at the time. Aviation was dangerous for lots of reasons, but they were some of the best pilots in the country at the time, and they did an extraordinary job. So aviation is the perfect example. It's cutting edge. It's critically important to the American strategy. It is, so essential to the war. And women literally at every step of the way are finding that they are at the center of it. And I just love that.
Well, and Baumgartner has a role in the dropping of the atomic bomb as well. Can you address that?
Absolutely. So she's such a talented flyer. And I love this because she never thought of herself as a pilot. She graduated from college and sort of was like adrift, living in New York, and couldn't figure out what she wanted to do. And she sees a plane flying through the sky one afternoon and decides she's going to become a pilot. We should be glad that she did. She gets her pilot's license. She signs up for the WASP, and is so effective that she gets put on all these really tricky missions. So she's flying towing targets for anti-aircraft artillery, live fire exercises. She later is selected as one of the only women test pilots to go to Wright Air Force Base and test the most advanced military planes, including the bomber that drops the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so She, by the time that this happens, has been deactivated and is sitting probably in her home with her radio on, hearing about the dropping of the atomic bomb. But she knows in her heart that she's one of the women who tested that plane to make sure that it could complete its mission successfully, and finds also that the engine overheats. So it was good. We should be glad that she does. But she also flies she's the first woman ever to fly a jet plane, because it was one of the ones that was being tested at the end of the war. So she's just an extraordinary example of what, quite frankly, is happening in so many different contexts of women being in the right place at the right time with a lot of skill and getting access to some of the most important moments in World War II history and in American history. And that's, I mean, Baumgartner is just absolutely one of my favorite stories.
So I mean, as we all know, that everybody recognizes the role of women, and we've honored their contributions. And after 1945, everything was just spiffy, and we've all moved forward into the future. But of course, you demonstrate, and not just with stories, but with actually data and facts, that that's not the case. And one of the things that I found kind of interesting was the relationship between these women and the feminist movement, and because when you look at that, I have a young daughter, not so young now actually, but they don't look at these women in World War II as the pioneers of this. So why not? Where does that misconnect happen, and how does that impact how we remember Baumgartner and these other women?
This is another great tragedy of this generation, and I'll give you my theory of what happened. I'm not sure that I'm quite right about it, but it certainly seems to have resonated in talking about it. In 1945, 1946, these women get deactivated. They go home, and everybody wants to go back to normal. I think people could relate to this now, especially post-COVID, that the moment it's over, you just kind of want to forget it happened. But in 1945 and 1946, normal for women was going back to the home, becoming homemakers. And many of them actually wanted to do that. They had delayed it for a lot of their lives. Many of them sort of are like, see ya, I'm never doing that. This was great. I've got new skills, and I'm going to New York or San Francisco or whatever and leaving this all behind. But many women did go home and got back to this normal. I think as part of that, was an underlying message to a lot of women that served in uniform that their experiences weren't worthy of further discussion, and they didn't talk about it. Not many people, I think this is generational, I think a lot of people didn't want to talk about World War II, but even many years later, we weren't asking these women about their stories. And so when you look at the sort of contemporary arc of the women's movement in the 20th century, there's this yawning gap in the 1940s of the greatest generation. You go from the suffragists, at the turn of the century, to the women's liberation movement, and then in between, nothing happens, according to sort of our conventional understanding of this, which is just so wrong. And I like to say that if we had asked these women, they would probably tell you that the military is a warfighting machine. Of course, that's its primary job, but it's also an employer. And that means that many of the first battles related to integrating women into the workplace were fought by women veterans of World War II. The anecdote I like to use is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in one of her first appearances at the Supreme Court, is advocating on behalf of a lieutenant in the Air Force to get benefits for her husband. Right. The military women are sort of inadvertently at the center of the women's movement for most of the 20th century and today. And this sort of yawning gap, I think, is a product of us not asking about some of those experiences and understanding that a lot of the battles we fought in the 60s and the 70s to get women into the workplace were the front line of that. The first salvo was in World War II, and it was often in uniform. And so it's a great sadness of mine, but I think as we tell these stories, as we remember these women, particularly now, unfortunately, after many of them are gone, we can do our best to make that known and to correct our daughters and our, granddaughters' assumptions about what military women have contributed to this important progress.
So there has been a lot of effort lately to honor women. So the 688 Postal Battalion was awarded, wrong picture, sorry, was awarded a Congressional Gold Medal, and there's a movie coming out about them. The WASPs were awarded a Congressional Gold Medal. The women who worked in the wartime industries at home, i.e. Rosie the Riveter, also received a Congressional Gold Medal. Have you thought about launching an effort to honor all the women who served in uniform in World War II?
I mean, I would love to. I will say this. I think one of the great I am one voice in a big picture, largely populated by women veterans themselves who have been advocating for years, and I mean decades, to give women the credit that they deserve. So the first place I stumbled on this story was actually the Military Women's Memorial, which is a national memorial on the mall, the National Mall, that honors women who've served in any capacity during the 20th century, 21st century. And I love them. I love that group of women. I love what they're doing there. And I think women veterans have been fighting this battle, alongside all the other work that they're doing on the military, really smartly and very sort of just so with such laser focus, and they're finally seeing the fruits of that labor. So I think about the 6888, all of that credit that they're getting is basically a small group of Black women veterans who have been pounding the table for years that these women should get the credit that they deserve. And so while I would love for for Spielberg to come to me and say, forget Masters of the Air, forget all of these other things that we've been releasing. We're going to do something about the women who served. I would love that. If anyone knows them, please give them my number. But the first thing I would do is be to direct them to these communities of incredible women veterans who have been fighting this fight for decades. And I am only, just trying to magnify what they're doing, because they really have been the stalwart defenders of this legacy for decades. So I'm very grateful to them. And if you know any of those folks, please give them my number.
We'll do our best.
You heard it now, guys. Take care of that. Lena Andrews, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour for what's been a fascinating conversation. We did get one comment who said, well, I thought this was going to be a boring topic, and it's really interesting. So it's like, yes, great win. It's a win. Your book, of course, is Valiant Women. I have to lean in to read this. The extraordinary American servicewomen who helped win World War II. So if you're interested in the topic, you can take a look at that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, man.
Thank you, guys. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, and I have to hit the right button here. I'm having, it's been a while. It's been 2 weeks
It's been a
since
while,
I've done this, so it's a little hard. Yeah. So next week, Chris, we will talk with Dan Hampton about his book, Vanishing Act, the enduring mystery behind the legendary Doolittle raid over Tokyo. Did you know there was an enduring mystery?
I didn't. I kind of thought we flew over there, we dropped some bombs, and
there's an enduring mystery, and one plane may have had a little bit of a different mission.
Ooh, and the fact that we're going to be live again, that's also a mystery too for 2 weeks.
Right. Well, I think we're live for the next, starting this week. We have 7 weeks in a row that we're live.
Holy cow.
So as you traipse across Europe, as I come back to Europe, whatever we're doing, we're just going to be live. It's just
stock up on some extra cocktail mixers.
Yeah, or no dose, or both. Hey guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, and back us on patreon.com. Browse us at historyhappyhour.com. There it is.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.